Please find your seat. The program will begin shortly. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. The program is about to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to this session, and what a beautiful venue and beautiful weather for us, right? So I hope we have a great conversation. My name is Auni Farajalla. I am the Chief Medical Officer for Takeda, and it's a pleasure to be here moderating this session. So before we start, can I just have a show of hands? How many of you are wearing a device that is a health device, an Apple or a Okay, how many has a health device on their phone? Okay, so a lot of it. So you're all part of today's discussion because today is all about how we as patients and as people are contributed to the innovation in science and how the data that's being collected actually informs the science that we're bringing together. So we have a tendency to believe that the science starts in the lab, or it starts with a molecule, or starts in a clinical observation. But what if we continue to say that the science is a spectrum where, yes, there is the lab, there is the clinical outcomes, but there is also what we feel, how we feel about if we're implicated in a particular disease, or if we have a loved one implicated in the disease, and how they actually feel about that disease, because everyone experiences different. And today is really about that, about how do we incorporate how patients feel, what do they think about their disease in our scientific agenda and in how we build the science that delivers to patients. I'm joined here by an esteemed panel that I'm going to ask them to introduce herself here in a minute, and I'm looking forward to a very open conversation. We're going to open it up for questions towards the end of the discussion, so please keep your questions as well. So Leah, let me start with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Leah Howard. I am the president and CEO of the National Psoriasis Foundation, and we represent the 8 million people in the United States who live with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. So let me give you just a little bit about psoriatic disease because it'll be helpful as we go through the conversation. So psoriasis is a chronic systemic immune-mediated disease. So what does that mean? Once you're diagnosed with psoriasis, you will live with psoriasis for the rest of your life. There are great treatments, and I'll talk about those as we get into this conversation. It's systemic, so the inflammation that you see on your skin, which remember the skin is the largest organ, right, is also representative of the inflammation that's happening throughout the rest of the body. So our community experiences higher rates of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, diabetes, mental health, because there's inflammation happening in all those other organs in addition to the inflammation happening in your skin. And it's immune mediated, so there's something happening within the immune system. And the good news about our community is that we have been beneficiaries of decades of amazing science, and there are great drugs available today that can get our patient community to a place where their skin is clear and their joints are well managed.
Great, thanks, Leah. Winston?
Good morning. My name is Winston Yan. I'm a physician scientist and also a genome engineer. So I did my PhD in one of the first demonstrations of CRISPR genome editing in human cells. You can hear about that in a session coming up next with Francis Collins. The reason why I'm here is I actually work on another corner of medicine, that's in rare disease, and specifically in ultra-rare disease. So Leah just described psoriasis. We are in potentially the other spectrum where there's so many, I would say there are cases that you hear of patients who, or families who have received a diagnosis where they're only one of 10 in the whole world that have come with that disease. And so in those settings, often the patients are forced into becoming their own diagnostician. They're forced to figure out a pathway. And increasingly, they're getting the tools to be able to push and drive the agenda of not only the science, but the drug development. I actually see people in this room who embody that so well. And so that's what I'm here to share, is that perspective, the power of the patient in these rare diseases, that no one else is going to advocate for them but themselves. What are they doing? I helped start a nonprofit called the N of One Collaborative, where in these patients and physicians who are developing these ultra-rare disease, there's a tremendous power to pooling that information and data, sharing resources so that we're not reinventing the wheel again and again on these cycles. And we're just very thrilled to share that perspective in this panel.
That's great. Thank you so much, Winston. And Vindel, let me...
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Vindel Washington. I'm the Chief Physician Executive at Verily Health. Verily is a technology company. Our parent, you might know a little bit better, it's Alphabet, and we're one of the bets. You probably know some of our sister bets a little bit better in terms of Google and Waymo and those folks, but we've been at it for about 9 years or so. The sole goal of Verily is to provide a technical infrastructure for both research and care, and our mantra is to bring the goal of precision health to everyone every day. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. And I'll do one other shout out from the stage. My wife's on the front row, Kimberly. Why am I asking you or giving you that information? It's so that you can be very kind to me in my comments. You don't want me to go home and be embarrassed on stage. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today, though.
That's great. So welcome to all three of you. I really look forward to the conversation. Let me start it off with the first question. So what has fundamentally changed in that we're having this conversation today, right? Why are patient data is important to innovation? Maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to say about patients' data and patients in this space in particular is think about the moment that you're asking and need patient data in most instances. You're asking a person who's under stress or someone who's sick, and you're putting an extra burden on them to gather information from them. And in that state, you want them to answer questions, you want them to show up on time, you want them to drive across town. So what's different today? Some of what's different is what you have on your wrist or what you have in your pocket. The possibility of passively collecting data and having that data be accurate, having that data and the possibility of laying on top of it AI agents, AI tools, things that can do really high-level analytics. And I'll share with you one sort of anecdote in this space. Many years ago, you would see the little flashing green light on the back of your phone if you set it aside. In this day and age, that whole photo plethysmography kind of setup is to the point where the beat-to-beat variability and the heart rate variability and all the readings of those are scores better than they were just 4 or 5 years ago. So not only is it less burden for the individual patient, the data sources are better, and the data sources allow the partnership that you really want from a patient, which is to gather the information to help them in the future without placing unnecessary burden on the individual.
Great. So, Leah, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I would agree that the methods of collecting the data have improved, making it easier for patients to offer their data. I also think we're just doing a better job of gathering better data. So when you think about a space like mine, if you look at the therapies in psoriatic disease 10 or 20 years ago, the main data that was collected in psoriasis was body surface area clearance for the drug. So that is the traditional measure of how severe someone's disease is, how much body surface area they have. If you have less than 10%, you have, or less than 3%, you have mild, 3 to 10% moderate, more than 10% is traditionally considered severe disease. What that doesn't take into account is where the disease is located. So if you have disease on your face, your genitals, your hands, you're going to be more impacted. Those are high impact sites. It also doesn't take into account things like pain, quality of life, the impact that the disease is having on your ability to participate in social activities or in work functions. So today, we are doing a better job of gathering that data, and that data is now informing decisions on innovation, drug development, and how patients are able ultimately to access those therapies.
That's great, Leah. Winston, you know, in traditional clinical trials, we administer a questionnaire and we ask the patient to remember what has happened over the last months and so forth. It is hard when you have a rare disease or you have when, to try to remember because you've been living in this pretty much all day. What's your perspective on this, and how does what this has changed now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's really, to dovetail that question with the first question that you asked of why now, I think there's two main factors. One is access and the other is technology. What I mean by access, so actually let me paint the picture for you. So these are rare diseases in which they're incredibly severe. They're not just something you can live with. There are hundreds of millions across the world affected. A significant number of those are children, and half of those children affected by rare disease, they pass before age 5, right? So just think about it, like, what would you do for your child? What would you not do? I think that's a better question, right? And so once upon a time, it was that the medical professionals held really the access and the means of treatment. They would provide you advice and being like, well, I think you should do supportive care and enjoy the rest of the time you have. And I think parents just said, no, that's not sufficient, right? That's not a satisfying answer. So then you have access of being able to look online. I know you have the proverbial Dr. Google or now the Dr. ChatGPT, which sometimes doctors can rail against, but really they're empowering patients and families to say, I get to take information in my own hands, consult researchers, contact researchers, and start forming a plan of action. And then you have technology. Yeah. Like, here's where we're coming in the second piece of it, where increasingly you have access to tools that can help you track and see the baseline, track your condition, generate that natural history data, which is a way of saying, here's what happens normally in disease, so that you can build up the data that's often too rare for these physicians to really collect on a regular basis. And then you have increasingly drug development that is becoming democratized, where a patient can go to a manufacturer or an animal, building a disease model. They have that clout to do it. The challenge still remains funding. And that is a separate discussion altogether. But I think it is a really remarkable time for these parents, often incredibly motivated to shine a light on what can be done for their loved ones.
That's great. Thanks so much. I mean, it's clearly we're able to collect data now. The question is, how does data translate into evidence that you can actually use and have an impact, whether it's with the regulator, with the access, with different key stakeholders? So maybe Leah, I'll ask, how do you think we can make this, all the data that we're collecting, make it meaningful and impactful?
Yeah. I think that's the critical issue, is that translation and ensuring at the end of the day the data is driving, whether it's regulatory decisions or coverage decisions. And there's a lot of people out there collecting data. So a couple of thoughts on this. I would say one of the things that we've done at the National Psoriasis Foundation is to engage the decision makers directly, to ask them questions about what data are you looking for, so that as we gather data, which we've been doing for 30 years, and we publish on that data, that we're ensuring that we're meeting those needs. About 10 years ago, we started a payer engagement program where we brought together a group of payers with a roundtable series. And every year since, we've met with different payers to ask them questions about the data they need, the challenges that they're having, and understanding our patient population so that we can go out and fill those gaps. The other thing I think you need to do is bring both patients and decision makers, payers, for example, to the table as you're designing studies. So one example of that is a project that we did with the University of Pennsylvania and University of Utah called the LIGHT study that was funded by PCORI. It's about a $5 million initiative that looked at home phototherapy versus office-based phototherapy. Because what we were hearing from patients for decades was that a subset of patients loved phototherapy, but they couldn't get it at home. They had to go into a clinician's office, and every time they did, 3 times a week for 8 to 12 weeks, they were paying a $30 to $50 copay, amounting to more than $1,000 in out-of-pocket costs for them for an incredibly cheap therapy. And so we developed a study study that had us as the patient community at the table in the design process, but also had payers. So we had a patient engagement committee, a payer engagement committee, and a physician expert engagement committee from the very beginning of the study through every stage and then in the publication. And so the ultimate publication had me as an author, had the investigators from the two institutions, and then had payer authors as well. And so I think having those conversations so that we're ensuring the data that we're gathering is the right data, we're putting it out, it's not sitting on a shelf somewhere, and then we're engaging with the decision makers as they review that data to make sure that they understand the data and they don't have questions about what that data says about the patient perspective.
Great. No, thanks, Leah. So Vinay, let me ask you a question. How do you use this data for policy influencing and real-world evidence?
Yeah. If I can take a half a step back and I'll swing back to the policy question. I love Leah's comment about, is it the right data? And I think we all need a little bit of humility when it comes to using data in these settings. The anecdote I'll give to you is that we started some work with some Stanford pediatric endocrinology groups, and that's a group at the time that had been used to getting a few blood sugar readings from the parents bringing in for their kids over a period of time. And we started the initiative with continuous glucose monitoring, and you went from a few readings to 300 or 400 readings that showed up at a visit. What do you do with 300 or 400 readings if you have not done that work in the past? Is it the average? Is it the standard deviation? What is the framework that you need to use to make an important clinical decision at that point in time? So one of the initiatives, I think, as you're talking about what to do with the data, is have you been humble enough as a medical establishment? Have you partnered with folks in the community? Have you done the work to make sure that the decision points are the right decision points with the data? And that's a recognition that we need to have. And the second point, I just love Winston's point about like the Dr. Google piece. I would say one of the things that we think deeply about at Verily is, can you trust the answer that's given if you're giving a broad answer? So yes, you can upload some things in the chat GPT to get answers, et cetera, but is it the right answer for me as an individual? And I love the sort of opening ceremony piece where the person nearly died from the epiglottitis endoscopy. The right answer for some patient in some setting, but maybe not that patient. So part of this work, I think, that's in front of us is not just using the data correctly, but also being really confident and humble about where you are on the journey for this work, and is it really precise and meant for you? To your question about policy, one of the things I think that's really great that's going on, actually over a couple of administrations in a row, is this idea that real-world evidence is important. And so there have always been thoughts around what CMS does with data and what FDA does with data in the post-release phase. But now you're seeing more and more an obligation on our friends like Takeda and others to make sure that you have good post-release evidence. And what's important about the real-world evidence, we all know that studies are done in a relatively controlled fashion. I want to know very precisely about this drug in this setting, and I eliminate all the other elements of this encounter to make sure I'm looking just at that particular drug's effect. But we all know that's not how people live. We all know that if you're a diabetic, 70% of diabetics actually have hypertension. Does hypertension have any particular effect on the drug we're talking about? Does my zip code have any particular effect on the drug we're talking about? Does my other social drivers of health affect it? So the importance in this policy shift is we're moving to a scenario where the patient themselves, their engagement, their circumstance, the life they live is going to be an important element of how we look at the success of therapies as they've been in the market for a while. And I think that's a really good movement in the federal government.
That's great. No, thanks, Verily. Winston, I want to get your perspective on this, but I want to add a twist to the question. How do you think that this system breaks down here?
So I think that, in what way? The system, which system? I guess there's multiple ones. Yeah.
Now, how do you think, is there, for rare disease, do you think the collection of the data and how is that a process, this process breaks down somewhere? No,
I think that's a really thoughtful question. So there's a couple ways in which you have rare, in some ways, has the misnomer of calling itself rare, right? As in, these are actually individually rare, but collectively common. But by definition, a lot of these diseases that have different genetic origins and stuff, they're slightly different, right? And I think with data collection and more granular data collection, people are like, oh, I can't make sense of this, right? Like just that endocrinologist receiving 300 readings. Where we come at it, it's that you haven't made sense of it yet, right? Greater resolution isn't a bad thing as long as the data is collected well. And that's a separate question of how do you actually harmonize the data collection and have standards so that we make sure that all the effort that's put in up front to make sure the data is collected well. But so a lot of it comes down to thinking through with that increased resolution, what are new insights you're able to draw for it? So in some ways it's hard because we now are dealing with more and it's added on to the workload of physicians and scientists. But I do think it's opportunity as well. To the point of real world evidence collection, I think there's a very benefit in rare disease where it's helping a lot because you can imagine these drugs on very rare populations. It's hard to collect enough data to make the approval decision, right? It seems so final. It's like you have so much data that's being pulled in on, is it helping the patient? Is it doing better than the, you often can't do placebos in this case. So one solution to it is actually to extend the phase of the trial, to approve it, to actually have the drug get reimbursed and paid for it so it can get to patients more easily, and just follow that trajectory in the real world so you can see how it does. And I think technologies are a great enabler of that. So in both ways, rare diseases are like this subset, but they're a great testing ground for these qualities because you have such motivated groups and often such strong need.
Great. One of the things that I've been thinking about is that as we're collecting new data and collecting patients' data, how can this data inform our early discovery and early understanding the bringing in new medicines and new products, new mechanisms of action. So I'm interested. Maybe I'll start with you, Winston, and then I'll go to you.
So I love this question because I feel like this is so much of what people. I would love for you to understand how medicine over hundreds of years has happened. It's not always through randomized controlled trials. It's not always through perfection, but it's actually through iteration. And actually, the faster that we can get into the real population of interest, aka human beings versus animals, and as long as we do that in a safe and controlled way, the quicker we can turn that iteration loop. So I'll give you a very real example from a drug that one of my mentors was developing just for one patient. It was there's basically a pediatric seizure disease in which this infant was age 2 and having upwards of 60 seizures a day. And the natural history of that is that they don't live past age 2. So my mentor developed a very specific, a custom drug just for that one individual. They dosed the patient with it. And their seizures actually of this patient went to 0 for the course of a couple of weeks. But what they also found was that there was an adverse event, one that had not been seen before across this entire category of drugs that just happened. And the decision was made for one patient of the 2 to continue, but another patient to stop, and ultimately that patient passed. What happened from that learning, that patient's donation, and their family continues to say this, their donation to the field is, don't let that just end with the death of their 2-year-old, but let that actually be a learning for drug developers in the future how to make medicine safer. And so indeed, another pharma company, based on the data that was shared publicly, not hid under a rock, because it's tough to share bad data, right? That data was shared publicly, and another pharma company actually took on the development of that. They found out what was making that drug have that, essentially an inflammatory reaction in your spinal fluid, and the next generation was safer. So this is exactly the type of cycle where in rare disease, where the benefit risk is just extraordinary for just having a treatment, you can close the loop of these, these molecular innovations, and you can drive whole platforms forward.
Great. No, thanks. That's great insight.
Yeah, one other construct or concept here is the resolution with which you can identify a particular disease process. And what I mean by that is if you think about what we're able to do in the precision medicine space now versus decades ago, things are much different. So the anecdote I'll give is that somewhere around 100 years ago when I went to med school, the way that you talked about breast cancer was by morphology. You looked at where it came from, you looked at it with H&E staining, you then determined whether it was some sort of ductal breast cancer, et cetera. That's where it ended, and you gave therapies in that way. Now, you wouldn't think about treating someone with breast cancer without thinking about, is it HER2 positive, or like they're receptors that you want to know about before you start this process. We have a better vision or more resolution. We have a real-time example at Verily. We've done work with the University of Colorado around AML. So you take that cancer diagnosis, it's a really bad cancer, 40% survival rate. And in that work, as we've done some more genomics and proteomics with the disease, we found a subtype of AML that responds actually to an orphan drug and has a very high success rate of treatment. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that the strategies before were bad strategies in the drug development. It just means we have a better microscope, in air quotes, for determining the disease, and then the testing cycle that we're talking about and that Winston's talking about, I will try X with this particular disease through a randomized controlled trial, et cetera, is sharper and sharper, and the results are better and better. And that's not a hypothetical. I think as we think about disease types, it's not going to be things like AML. And I will tell you, and at least in some of the preliminaries, it's not just going to be genetics or genomics or those kinds of things that make the determination. It might very well be my air pollution exposure. It might very well be what chronic diseases have I had in the past, or my inflammatory status based on whether or not I've had influenza over some period of time. I think that's the real new promise here, that precise has gone to a degree that we have not thought about or even dreamed about in the past, and that's what I think our future is in this space.
Yeah, if I could build on that,
Yeah,
I think
sure.
what's really interesting in a disease space like mine where there's a lot of patients is we know and we see there's significant heterogeneity of disease. So within a population of 8 million, I've had psoriasis nearly 30 years, but why has my psoriasis not really progressed where someone else could develop disease and go from mild case to severe overnight? Or why don't I have psoriatic arthritis and someone else does? Or why are there twins, identical twins, where one twin has psoriasis and the other does not? I think these questions and answering these questions from a scientific standpoint enable us to then identify which of the available treatments is going to work best for that patient. We see significant examples where patients are going on therapies and cycling through therapies before they find the therapy that works for them. That's obviously costing the system money. It's creating anxiety and stress for the patient, in addition to the fact that they're not getting well, and so they're potentially on a path to having additional damage to their joints, for example, if they have psoriatic arthritis or issues from their psoriasis. So if we can use the new data that we're able to gather to both better understand these subpopulations, but then also pulling it through to access and treatment decisions, utilize that to drive the decision-making process, and of course for the insurers to then cover those therapies that would deem to be best for that patient. I think that's the future that we're all hoping for.
No, I totally agree. And all of three of you are underscoring something important, right? Is that there is no one size fits all, right? And trying to understand, and the data that we collect and the data that you're providing patients, and is actually helps us inform that more and more so that we can customize that therapy to the patient. That takes a really important business to a very important question is, to be able to collect this data, you need to build trust with the patient, right? And be able to have that, because I think from my experience, patients are willing to give us the data. The question is, what are you going to do with it? What are you, how are you going to safeguard my information? So tell me, maybe let's start with you, Leah, about how do we build that trust and how do we, bring that so that we can all benefit from it?
Sure. Trust is certainly a topic that's come up in a number of Aspen sessions that I've sat in, the challenge of trust in science overall right now in this moment. I think when it comes to asking patients for their data, you can't begin a relationship by saying, give me something, right? And so patients are not going to have trust in you by starting off the dynamic that way. Patients do need to understand what you want to do with that data, the role of that data. And so obviously there's consenting there. There's a conversation that happens with patients that has to be one that they can understand. What is the purpose of this data collection? How will my data be used? And ultimately, is it going to benefit me, or at least how will it benefit my community, and I know you can talk about that from a rare disease perspective. But when we think about doing that, certainly organizations like mine that have been gathering data for years, I think are in a unique position to be able to have those discussions with the patient community, because they understand we're not selling anything. We're there at the end of the day to do research, education, and advocacy to help our community get to a place where psoriatic disease doesn't burden their life. And so I do think building a relationship first, having candid and honest conversations, it starts with transparency, of course, communication second, and then really that understanding of why you're in it with them and the role that they can play from the beginning, and giving patients the ability to decide what that data collection looks like. What is the data you're going to collect? How will it be used? And are you answering the questions that matter most to me?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll build on those points and say that, to me, having the conversations up front, I realize I actually never told you my background of what I do for a living. It's like, I'm actually a drug developer. I am now a drug developer for ultra-rare diseases in academia at the Broad Institute, where I lead the Center for Therapeutic Genetics. But before that, I co-founded a gene editing biotech where we took something from essentially a business plan to dosing in patients. And we did it in a rare disease. And in developing that drug, it was so critical to get the patient input up front on the clinical trial design, on the assessments, on the burden. Those are activities that are really made possible at patient organizations, because there's the simple thing of just efficiency, right? Instead of talking to a bunch of patients individually, you can go to the node that they already go to and trust. And then if you have a good relationship with the patient group, there's implicit trust because they trust you guys, right? And I think the other thing is just bringing them early versus going to them with like, here is our protocol. Look, these assessments you're gonna have to do because that's just the way we designed it, versus like, oh, I realize that you're caring for your sick child. Going 3 hours every 2 weeks is not feasible. Like, can we do it in a scientifically meaningful way while still having a good rapport? So it's just the dialogue and communication.
Wendell?
Yeah, I'm gonna restate some of Leah's answers, and hopefully since I answered after her, you'll forget that she said it and you think that I said it first. So what I have said at Verily a lot is that trust is really built on a series of promises kept. It's not a one-shot thing. You really have to have an approach that includes the transparency that you mentioned. So this idea of all of tech, all of AI sort of existing in a black box, and you can't know what happens over here. You can't know the data sets that this thing was trained on. It's all proprietary, I think, is the quickest way to lose the trust of folks that you're trying to gain their trust. I think there is this concept of trust by proxy that Winston mentioned, like in communities where there are trusted individuals, whether it's design of studies or even therapeutics getting offered, making sure that you recognize that there are ambassadors that might be a part of this solution set, trusted individuals in communities that could help open the doors for the work that you're trying to do, I think is super important. So really this concept of transparency and the why, I think are the two critical elements in developing trust over time, and having some patience as an organization that a single app released at some point in time isn't the magic bullet to develop trust with the communities you're trying to serve. That's only developed over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, thanks for your answer to this. I do have one last question before we open it up for the audience here. If you have a crystal ball, we're looking 5, 10 years in the future, how do you see patient data play in the scientific innovation that we're talking about here today? And what are the things that we need to change in the system as we go? Maybe 2 minutes each. Let's make it rapid here. So I'll start with you, Leah.
So crystal ball. So, I think looking into the future, that does not look like patients participating in research. They're already doing that. I think the future really looks like patients driving the research and having that innovation start with a conversation with the patient community to really understand what matters most to them, what are the gaps and needs that are not being met today, and what are they looking for in the next discoveries. And so it's really patients designing the research and then participating. And the other point, which we haven't talked about, is ensuring that the data captures the entire community. And so as I think about the future in our space, I spend a lot of time thinking about those subpopulations of people living with psoriatic disease who are underserved today. That could be pediatrics, because there aren't great options yet for them. That could be communities of color or individuals with tougher to treat psoriatic disease. And so it's really ensuring that it's not just the patients that have the more common types of disease, the easier to treat psoriasis, the thing that they walk into a dermatologist's office and immediately they know, yep, you have psoriasis. It is that patient that has gone through 4, 5, 6 dermatologists, who's gotten multiple misdiagnoses, who's had difficulty finding a treatment that works for them, that the innovation conversations are being centered there as well, and not just with this bigger pool of patients that are going to be easier to serve.
Okay, thanks, Lou. Winston, what's your thought?
Yeah, so I really hope that there's a future where patients participate and do these things because they want to and not because they have to in order to find treatment for their loved ones. And I think that what I've conveyed to you of those families leading the drug discovery for their loved one, there are millions of patients with rare disease. There's a very small subset of them who have the means, the time, the know-how to actually drive that. I would love to see a future in which it's just a standard of care for these types of, whether it's data collection, the treatments, the whole process of developing a brand new treatment. That's just a part of the medical system, just like we do an organ transplant. Tremendously complex, but why does someone have to figure out how an organ transplantation gets done for their loved one, like figuring out a liver transplant, right? The second, and this will be quick, it's actually inspired by your hand-raising experiment, is that I would love for rare disease to have a much more unified knowledge of what actually is rare genetic disease. So let's do this. How many of you have heard of rare disease? Can you raise your hand? Okay, that's actually awesome. So how many of you have heard of cystic fibrosis? Okay, that's even more. Sickle cell, right? So those are actually all rare diseases. How many of you have heard of KCNT1 epilepsy? Okay, so that's another rare disease. So now let's do the experiment of how many of you have heard of cancer? Okay, right? And how many of you have heard of lung cancer? How many of you heard of leiomyosarcoma? Okay, so you can, that's all types of cancers, and we battle cancer as a whole, right? Whereas we are fragmented in rare disease of advocating for specific diseases, and there really should be a unified approach to say these are all genetic diseases. We now have the tools to be able to do this, and we should be able to incorporate that in a standardized process to help the millions with disease. So thanks for indulging me.
Yeah, thanks, Winston. Bendel.
Yeah, I'm going to give a data answer, and I'm going to give a shout out to my friend in the back row, Karen DeSalvo. We worked on this concept in the Obama administration of the learning health system. So my best vision of the future is a future in which there's no such thing as bad data or this data isn't worthy of research. I can't make an inference. I can't make a discovery. I envision a future where the distinction between the data that's good enough for care and the data that's good enough for research and innovation, there's no distance between the two. And that every day, every patient who comes through a system has a chance to get a better outcome than folks who were seen the day before, and that we have a smooth and a continuous circle of improvement that exists. That's the world I hope for in the future.
Great. Thanks, Winston. So it's time to us to open it for the audience questions. Okay, I'll start here.
We can hear you.
Very loud. I'm happy to be loud. Okay. Hello? Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Catherine. Really nice to meet all of you. I think all of you have touched on this in one way or another, but I'm curious if you can talk about how you go from sort of anecdotal evidence, what might be based on what somebody, like data from what someone ate that day, or if someone was in a, say, somewhat smokier environment at altitude or whatever. How do you go from that to noticing from like an anecdote to what is like a meaningful either correlation or causation? And how do you figure out what, if it is a causation of the therapy or of the therapy and the environment? I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, Wendell?
Yeah, and in some ways you can look at the learning cycles that you see in AI and other machine learning models is one of the ways that happens over time. And the way it happens over time is you have some percentage you give an attribute of its importance to a particular outcome. So say if it's the smoking or the altitude scenario, and some point in time you're measuring good or bad, did people do well or less well? Over the point of time, enough data circles happen, enough people are in that environment in which you can say, yes, it's super important if you're at altitude for this particular outcome you're looking for. That's a pretty established cycle of learning. And so one of the things that you want to do to cheat that system is you can actually use people who have some pathophysiologic idea about how that works, but that system actually works without actually having all of the knowledge that's necessary. But you start with a little bit of a setup. I think this is correlated with this particular disease, and then you run cycles of learning within that system, like machine learning cycles, to make sure you know then that this is 20% of the reason that this particular outcome occurs. That's a pretty one of the ways you can use the leap from my idea to actually something that's causal.
Thanks.
The answer that I'll give is actually just listening to patients. So about a decade ago, the NPF got PCORI funding to create a citizen scientist platform where we had an instrument through which we gathered patient data. That data was collected, de-identified, and then both patients and researchers could actually go into the data set and ask questions of the data and make their own hypotheses. And the idea was that patients have these questions. They know naturally as they go through these lived experiences, I think there's something happening here. And by creating an environment in which they could pose the questions and then researchers could do follow-up, we felt that we could actually shed some light scientifically on some of them. And so we've published some papers on things like sleep, for example, that were written by both dermatologists and patients on their experience with their psoriasis and the impact it was having on their sleep based on the data in this 6,000 patient data set.
I mean, I think this is the central question in drug development and how you try to isolate what's actually because of the intervention you're doing. Yep. And I'll say there's two ways, just very briefly, there's two ways that you can try to average out things, right? One is you can have a population average. So instead of just one person, you try to do it across many people, and that's the traditional method. The other way is that you can track over time, and you tried, and by just doing things, I mean, a perfect example is if people have done like, dietary exclusions to be like, this makes my stomach hurt. And you just try different things over the course of time. You can start isolating what things are effective and not. And that's the data collection that happens over time. Even on an N of 1 basis, you can make informed decisions. The key is, like when people talk about a p-value, it's all about likelihoods, right? You're never 100% sure. And the goal is to have more and more of those observations over time to drive towards a likelier than not outcome.
Great. I think there's a question here, and then go to back there.
Hi. Thank you all very much. I'm hoping I'm going to articulate this well. So with regards to real-world evidence studies and how we position those studies in trying to engage the communities that are not likely to participate in your randomized control trials. I stood up a clinical research institute in the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas, South Texas, greater than 95% Hispanic. They weren't doing it, right? I mean, it was really hard. The education, the outreach that we had to do, the education to empower, to engage them. However, when we were bringing on real-world evidence studies, we found that a lot easier for us to talk to them and say, listen, there's not going to be an intervention. You're not going to get some unknown drug. We're just going to follow you. We're going to see what kind of reactions you have. Do you see real-world evidence studies as a way to further increase the participation of these underrepresented, difficult-to-reach patient populations? And I know that you mentioned the participants want to do the research. They do. But how do we get these studies to them, and how do we ease that concern, and how do we continue to gain the trust? What's Verily doing to bring that more kind of accessible type of participation to the patients?
Yeah, I think we should at least start with the first acknowledgement, which is the distrust and the lack of participation in communities that I grew up in and the communities you're describing is there for a reason. It's a logical output of what people have experienced in their dealings with the health system. So I think that's sort of the first place to start. And then I would say, if you're talking about communities like my community where I grew up, you have to have a scenario that appeals not just to the altruism of the individual, because often the burden of just living their lives is too much to ask these other elements. So when we think about it at Verily, what are the right things to do for communities that you're engaging in for this scientific purpose? One is you have to return the results of the studies. You have to have some interchange with them that makes them know that they're part of this larger element. I'm still surprised at the amount of return of results absence in some of the studies that are conducted across the ecosystem. The second is there are often things that happen that are for the benefit of the individual that we ignore in the discussion. So we know at this point, if you have a pediatric cancer and you're getting CAR T therapy, most of those therapies are occurring through studies. And so access is not just a lack of participation in the generation of knowledge for the future. Access means my community does not get the service and the provision of health opportunities that others get. In terms of the real-world evidence question in particular, I agree with you completely. I think that not only as we get better with our analytics and analysis, real-world evidence is increasing in its ability to deliver outcomes, not just in the population groups, as Winston was saying. I like his second point, which is you being your own control group is another way that that data is more and more important and more relevant as we go forward. And I do believe there's going to be a time where there's going to be more and more continued ability to use real-world evidence, particularly in communities that are often left behind. I think that's a great comment.
Right. I want to take the question in the back there.
Thank you, Janusz Kaleta from New York City, and I want to thank you for excellent presentation, Leah, Winston, but especially Dr. Washington, because I could see that he is really leading us actually all into the right directions and showing really where there is a gap with, within the data. And basically, as we are all witnessing the shift into the precision medicine, we have to realize that precision medicine will not succeed unless involves personomics. And personomics means knowing the patient, but as a person. And unless among all the omics that we are focusing on, including technology, unless we focus on personomics and we really get to know not the patient, not the clinical data, because that's really easy to collect with what we have at hand in clinical environment, but really the real world, the personal data that is much more harder to collect, but is critically important for succeeding in rare disorders, diseases, but also population health and so on. So thank you so much for excellent presentation.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and then we're happy to meet later off here for all the others, I'm sure. Let me take this because you've been raising your hand for a while.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question, and I'm sure you get this often, whether out of desperation or lack of access. Many patients, I'm a patient advocate, I've worked with many different organizations. Patients are just uploading willingly their information to ChatGPT and other platforms. A, do you have concerns? B, what would you tell your neighbor, your family member, or a patient about doing that? And then the second question is, how will that help us?
Yeah, I want to be careful that this doesn't come off as just a commercial, but I will say one thing. We have an app that's called Verily Me, and we've developed it in part for part of what you're saying, collecting data within a HIPAA-protected sort of environment where there's a care deliverer that's on the other side and then having an AI agent that's connected to it, we think is more of a wave of the future. I think that there will be more and more opportunities. Actually, we talk about it regularly for sensible regulation in the space to make sure that your data is protected. If any of you have done the exercise you've talked about, you can readily see that there are disclaimers that say that we're not a care provider and your data is data you have sort of willingly submitted, but with no catch on the other end. So are there improvements that can be made for the large model? I'm not saying there are not improvements in the model that happen because you've uploaded your data. It is a relatively unprotected environment. So back to this thing about trust that we talked about before, know where you put your health record, know what the covenant is that you've established with that group that you're submitting data. It would be my advice, general advice, and you should look for places where that aggregation and those questions and answers can be done in a protected environment.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you for all the participants here in the audience, Leah, Winston, Findel, sorry. It's been a pleasure having you on this committee here and on the panel. I hope you're leaving today with understanding that this is just the start of the conversation of how we're able, each and every one of us, to be a participant in the innovation and in the science, right? I just want to leave you with one thing. We are, each one of us, as we're looking at whether we're a patient or we're a caregiver, we are co-creators of the science and the innovation that we're doing. And it is time for us to move from that I'm being prescribed the medicine to I am participating in driving that science forward. So I leave you with that. And for those of you who haven't answered your question, we're happy to answer some of your questions here up front. Thank you for your attendance, and thanks for Aspen for putting this together.
Nice.
Great job.
Thank you.
Sounds really nice.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Thank
Loved
you, my
it.
friend.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Findel.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great moderating.
Thank you.